May live in interesting times. It's a saying of dubious origin that's typically attributed to being an ancient Chinese curse. The idea behind it being that it's better to live during a time of relative peace and calm as opposed to a time of change and dis-ease, strife, kind of like what we're living in. I think it's safe to say that we find ourselves living in the most interesting times in human history so far. But I think the times are only going to become more and more interesting as the years and decades progress due to the continual growth of the power and reach of technology. Because I think for all intents and purposes, we can see that for the most part, civilization and technology have risen in parallel with one another. 10,000 years ago, if you wanted to go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, it would take you a year, 2 years, if you could make it. 150 years ago, it would take you 2 to 3 months. And today it takes you a matter of hours, and if you want to travel on to the next continent, it'll be a few hours more. Technology continues to grow, and it continues to make our world smaller and smaller. In the big picture, humanity's containment and use of fire, the invention of the wheel, were really simply precursors to automation and artificial intelligence. Two technologies that will have a more and more radical effect on our society as the years proceed, as we become ever closer to the hypothetical technological singularity, which some theorize to be 2 to 2.5 decades away, perhaps less, perhaps more. For those of you who may not be aware, the technological singularity, as it's called, is that horizon point out in the distance past which we cannot theorize what technologies will be created because those technologies will be created by superhuman AI. Those technologies, particularly automation and AI, are already having an effect on our society today. If you go into any fast food restaurant built within the past couple years, I can nearly guarantee that you're going to be ordering from an automated screen. And of course, almost all of us walk around with an AI secretary in our pocket, not to mention Alexa and fellow technologies that are dispersed across millions of homes around the world. In 2001, when I was 16 years old, I got a job at a Kroger grocery store. And in order to get hired on there, you had to join the Food Handlers Union. Our union rep was constantly going on about we cannot allow them to put any more self-checkout kiosks in this store. Right? At the time, they had built one of these machines, I think 2 months before I got there. You know, these machines are going to take our jobs. When I go back to Columbus these days and I visit that store that I worked at, there's over 10. Right? Such is the way things are heading. So technology, particularly automation, particularly AI, are phenomenal on a personal level, on a human level, on the effect that they have in our lives because they make our lives easier. But in terms of the effect that they have on the society in which we live, the system in which we live, they will have a more and more radical disruptive effect as the decades progress. Because I'm sure some of you have seen the numbers that suggest circa 2040, 2045, we could be approaching somewhere between 40 and 50% unemployment due to these various technologies. And we're not just talking blue-collar jobs, we're talking white-collar jobs as well, because why would you hire a fleet of accountants if you can have an AI system do it better than all of these people combined? And then there are others who say, well, you know, as technologies come around and make other technologies irrelevant, these new technologies create new jobs. But the entire purpose of automation and artificial intelligence is to essentially reduce the need for human labor. We are beginning to come to a crossroads, right? We can continue going down the path that we've been going for however long, which in my opinion will lead to a radically stratified society in terms of economics, and most likely eventual bloodshed due to that. Or we can go down a new path that's really more of a threshold into a new era for humanity, and this new path really just became available to us a matter of decades ago. This man is named Buckminster Fuller, the renowned design scientist, creator of the geodesic dome, amongst other things, and he spent his entire life concerned with, in his words, how to make a world where everyone can make it, right? That was his primary concern. So in the mid-1970s, he began doing research to find kind of a time frame for when humanity would get to the point that everyone could make it. And as he finished up his studies, he did find a point in time, but to his surprise, it was not a point in time in the future, it was a point in time in the past. What he found was that around 1969, the human race came to the point where we had the technological ability, the economic ability, and the access to natural resources to feed, clothe, house, and educate every human being on the planet, to effectively end poverty. A few years later, the National Academy of Sciences said, well, that sounds interesting. Let's look into that. They did a follow-up study and confirmed Fuller's findings. You can see this in Fuller's book, Critical Path, which was released in 1982. What this means is that for the last half century, we've had the opportunity to bring humanity into a post-scarce era. To this point in time, all economies, all civilizations have been based on the idea of scarcity, that there are not enough resources for everyone. But now we live in an era where there are enough resources for everyone. We can enter into a post-scarce society, into a society based on abundance. For the last 50 years, the various institutions that govern our world, the powers that be, have really done next to nothing with trying to push humanity in that direction. And I think even more surprising to me is the fact that the vast majority of people have no idea that this possibility even exists. So a quote by Fuller, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." So that's why we're all here today, to discuss the possibility of creating a new model to replace the model in which we live, a better model, a new model of community, and perhaps eventually a new model of society or civilization. A society in which everyone's basic needs are met and which everyone has the opportunity to create the life that they've wanted for themselves. Everyone has the opportunity to live a fulfilled life, an opportunity to self-actualize. Because I think if we're being honest with ourselves, a child growing up in South Central Los Angeles today does not necessarily have the same opportunity to create the life that they want for themselves as a child growing up on Park Avenue, right? So I guess essentially what we're talking about in general is utopia. And I don't mean utopia in the sense of a place where everything is perfect and no problems exist, because perfection exists only in the realm of the ideal, right? Perfection is that goal for which we always strive, and no matter how close we get to it, it will always be infinitely far away. But what we are talking about is exactly what I've been saying, a place where poverty no longer needs to exist and everyone can self-actualize. So many forms of utopia have been theorized by men and women throughout history. You've got Thomas More's Utopia, H.G. Wells' Things to Come, and of course Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. But there was one person who lived during the 20th century who actually took the initiative to try and build a new kind of community to effect change on the planet. And that person's name was Walt Disney. When I'm not inviting interesting people such as yourselves to technology conferences in San Diego, I moonlight as a Disney historian. And I think one of the things that's most interesting to me about Walt Disney as a person is the final project that he worked on in his life. We've come to know it today as Walt Disney World, but not the Disney World that you may or may not have been to before, not a place with 5 theme parks and 25 hotels and 2 water parks and this, that, and the other thing. Yes, there was going to be a theme park, a clone of Disneyland, because the shareholders at the Disney company in the mid-1960s said, well, you got to put a theme park there. No one's going to come if you don't put a theme park there. But there's a reason he bought enough land to fit 2 Manhattans in that space. And that's because Walt Disney wanted to build Epcot, not the Epcot theme park that's there today, but the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. Walt Disney wanted to build a model city because, like many people living in America in the 1950s and 1960s, he witnessed the exodus from the cities and the growth of suburban life. And what Walt saw was that the people who could not afford to leave the cities saw the disintegration of the educational system, the disintegration of their families, the disintegration of their well-being, and Walt felt that the lives that these people were forced to live was beneath human dignity. So he felt, since I'm aware of this, I feel that it's my responsibility to attempt to change something. So to that end, he thought we can do better with our cities and make them places that people can thrive and grow. So in terms of what Epcot was, you can see that it was a radial design In the dead center of the city would be what he called the Cosmopolitan Hotel, where people visiting from around the world would stay. Directly outside of the Cosmopolitan Hotel was a retail district composed of grocery stores, shopping, food, restaurants, things of that nature. Directly outside of that would be offices for corporations and businesses that would be operating within the city, because actually right next to Epcot, there was going to be an industrial center composed at the time of corporations like Westinghouse and GE and Ford. I guess today they would be Google and Microsoft and Apple, Tesla. Directly outside of the offices would be the high-density apartments. And then outside of that was the large greenbelt, which would be parks, recreational activities, schools. And then at the very edge of the wheel would be the single-family homes. In terms of transportation, Walt Disney really did not like automobiles. He thought they were noisy, they were polluting, and that they were dangerous. So he was going to divert all automobile traffic underneath the city. And if you wanted to travel within the city, long distances would be covered by monorail, which of course was built at Walt Disney World. And short distances would be traveled by the Wedway People Mover, which was a transportation system Walt and his team actually created and patented at what eventually became Imagineering. So what Walt Disney wanted to create was a city of roughly 20,000 people with 0% unemployment, 0% homelessness, all connected by electrically powered mass transit. It's a fairly radical idea for the mid-1960s. I have no doubt that, like every other project he ever worked on, Epcot would have been a resounding success, but unfortunately he passed away in December of 1966, and with him went his dream of Epcot. When he passed away, the Walt Disney Company decided to move in another direction because they didn't figure out how to monetize societal improvement. So, taking Epcot as, I guess, a foundation point, we would like to improve upon the idea and to move it into the 21st century. It's been half a century later. And so from Epcot, we are here to talk about G.T.E.C, the Granttown experimental community. And when we talk about what a community of the future should look like and making a place that works for everyone regardless of income levels or backgrounds or anything like that, in terms of general infrastructure, we're talking about things like hydroponic vertical farms. We're talking about cell-cultured meat, lab-grown meats. Of course, renewable energy such as solar roofing, solar farms, things of that nature. We're talking about a large influx of robotics to kind of simulate what life would be like 20-some years from now. Robotics could be in kitchens, could be in food halls making food. We're talking about robotic coffee shops like Cafe X up in San Francisco. Of course, we need to think in terms of next-generation grocery stores like Amazon Go and things of that nature. Next-generation museums like this, which Team Lab out of Japan has made. Next-generation educational systems, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of pedagogy, right? Because our educational model today was created during the Industrial Revolution, right? And it's become pretty much irrelevant when the entirety of human knowledge almost is at your fingertips. So you don't need to memorize this, that, and the other thing so much as you need to be able to critically think and understand why this is important and why that is not important. Satellite campuses for major universities. And then in terms of not just the infrastructure component, but the human component, and being able to self-actualize and become an optimal version of yourself. Access to physical fitness, access to meditation, yoga. Trying out ideas such as a universal basic income, which as technological unemployment becomes more and more realistic, a UBI will become more and more realistic. And for those of you who may not be aware, the universal basic income is the idea that you eliminate welfare and you provide every person living within your society a stipend per month, right? So the number I've typically seen is about $10,000 a year would keep a person out of poverty, essentially. We're talking about a place for people of all faiths and no faith. We're talking about a radically diverse population that emulates the radical diversity that is continuing to grow within our society today. Not just diversity of ethnicity or race, but diversity of opinion and thought. We think of G.T.E.C as a laboratory, not only in terms of technologies to be applied to make human life better, easier, but also in terms of new forms of governments and new ways to improve society and human life as we move further into the 21st century. We hope that G.T.E.C will be a seed for where humanity might move in the 21st century. As the first G.T.E.C is a success, we hope to build more communities around the nation and around the world. And eventually, perhaps one day, we might be able to move it from a few thousand people in a community to tens of thousands of people in a city, with the hopes that at some point in time, these ideas will be able to be applied on a global level. That's the general idea. Again, I thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing what all of you have to say in the next couple of days.